Hi everyone, this is a channel with scary stories with which you can relax to the sound of rain or fire. If my channel helps you, please support me by liking and subscribing. Also, you can write from what country you are watching me. Everyone enjoy watching. I found my wife's obituary online, but she's sitting right next to me. I am chronically online. I Google lots of things and people when I'm bored. I've Googled my own name before, along with friends, acquaintances, conspiracy theories, and random internet sundries. But last night was the first time I'd Googled my wife's name, and I found something I'd never forget. The first hit was an obituary. Of course, I assumed it was someone with the same name as her. Her first name is Emily, and her last name is pretty common. Not going to share it here because I don't want to be doxxed. But I clicked it anyway, just out of curiosity. My heart fell through the floor when I saw a photo of my wife on the website. Blonde highlighted hair, dark eyes, and the dates matched up too, 1986 to 2012. According to this obituary, she died when she was 26. I met her when she was 27. There's no way, I thought. This must just be someone who looks like her, with her name and her birth year. But I knew it was too many coincidences to be wrong. When I read the actual obituary, it only cemented things for me. It mentioned her love of horses, her volunteer work at a soup kitchen through her church, and her work as a biologist postdoc. So many details matched up, there was no way it could be a coincidence. What you looking at? I jumped as my wife came in from the kitchen and sat down next to me. On instinct, I slammed the laptop shut. Nothing, I said. Then, realizing how suspicious I looked, I added, I was looking at birthday gifts for you. For a second, her face froze, and I was worried she wouldn't buy my lie. But then she smiled. That warm smile I loved, crinkling her eyes at the corners. That's so sweet, she said, coming to sit next to me. I swallowed. Yeah. She cuddled up next to me, but I felt completely on edge. The warmth of her skin no longer felt warm and inviting. In fact, a chill ran down my spine. After a few minutes, I extricated myself from her embrace. I don't feel good, I lied. I'm going to lie down. Okay, she said, pouting. Before she could say anything more, I ran upstairs. As soon as I got on the bed, I brought up the obituary again. I stared at the grainy image of her face. It was definitely her. That warm smile, those mysterious dark eyes. There was no way it could be anyone else. I scrolled through some of the other results, and I realized some of those, too, were related to her death. There was a Facebook memorial page, friends posting on it, names I didn't recognize, mourning her loss more than 10 years ago. The university she worked at had put out a statement with their condolences, as well. But then I found something that made my heart stop. A news article nestled at the bottom of the search results page. Emily hadn't just died. She'd been murdered. My jaw hung open as I read the news article. Phrases popped out at me. No signs of forced entry, partially dismembered, and killer still at large. The news article didn't have a photo of Emily though, so maybe this was a different Emily. It had to be. It couldn't be my Emily, who was sitting on the couch watching TV downstairs. A sound jolted me out of my thoughts. The door to the bedroom, creaking open. Emily stood in the doorway, oddly still. The hall light was off, shrouding her face in shadow. Emily? I asked, my voice shaking. I came up to check on you, she said in a soft, cool voice. Thanks, I said, quickly turning off my phone and slipping it behind me. I'm feeling a lot better now. I'm fine. I'm glad to hear that, she said, her voice going lower. I tried to keep my cool as she climbed into bed with me. I lay there, stiff and cold, as she wrapped her arms around me. I love you, baby, she whispered, as she cuddled with me under the covers. I love you too. So that's where I am now. I'm writing this from my phone, as Emily sleeps next to me. I don't know if I'm safe here. I don't know who, or what, I'm dealing with. All kinds of crazy scenarios have been floating through my mind. Did Emily have an identical twin that died, and she took over the twin's identity? Is she some horrible creature from folktales? Who killed Emily and took on her appearance? The more minutes that tick by, the wilder my theories get. None of them make sense. There's only one thing I'm sure of. Whoever, or whatever, I'm sleeping next to isn't the real Emily. My pen pal found me. I don't think he's so innocent anymore. Child abuse. I was 8 when I got my pen pal. It was a project at school. We were to write a letter about ourselves with our mailing address and our picture included. Then we'd tie each letter to a balloon and let them go. The goal was to practice letter writing and befriend someone on the process. To be honest, it wasn't such a bad idea if you ignore how dangerous it was. I think most of the kids got other kids to write to. Maybe a couple of them got tourists just dropping by for a week or two. It was just luck. Whoever found your letter was your pen pal. The first letter I got from my pen pal was as innocent as you could get. Percy and his wife Molly had sent a photo of them with their animals. They had a dog named Jukebox who was a husky Malamute mix, a Maine Coon cat named Indigo, and a box turtle named Webster. I found myself wishing they could be my family. I wished that I could snuggle up with Jukebox and take walks with Percy and Molly. I was a kid from an unstable home life and I craved the normalcy Percy and Molly had. I told them everything. I told them when my sister got mad and hit me. I told them when our foster parents got mad and hit Addison. I told them about being kicked out and meeting our neighbors, the Landrys, an old couple who never failed to be Addison and I's safe space. For about 6 months Percy was my best friend. That is, until I was moved to a different home and I didn't tell him I was moving. I could have sent a letter to his address and told him, but I remembered the last letter he'd sent. It had no postage stamp. Meaning, it had been hand-delivered. Something about that fact terrified me so much I told Addison about it. She slapped me around a bit, and then forbade me from talking to Percy. He's probably a pedophile. God, you're so stupid, she said after lecturing me on why I shouldn't have responded to him. Years passed. But Percy never forgot. He was the only one outside of the Landrys who knew that Addison and I shared a different birthday despite being twins. He never failed to send a birthday card on the 6th of May. No matter what foster home we had jumped to, the cards were your stereotypical drugstore birthday cards. Percy and Holly always wrote a handwritten note below it wishing me a happy birthday. As the years dragged on I started to realize how creepy that was. How unsettling it was that he knew what foster home I had moved into. That he was keeping tabs on me somehow. It wasn't until I met him in person that I realized how dangerous both he and Molly were. It was a normal night for Addison and I. We were hiking down the road that would take us to the Landrys, who we knew would be the only people up at 2 a.m. Though our last foster placement had taken us miles from their home, every time we were kicked out, we'd make the hike. Rain or shine, Addison spent the bulk of the walk telling me how horrible I was and that I had caused this. Addison does that a lot and I've begun to realize that she blames me even when it's her fault. I've come to believe that she can't blame herself because it hurts too much. So she blames me and she hurts me because she knows I'm the only one who will put up with it. She stopped mid-insult when a minivan came up behind us. The engine made an awful cock-clunking sound. Addison would know why. She's an expert with cars. She grabbed my arm gently. "Don't talk and follow my lead," she said softly. I barely nodded confirmation. The minivan stopped next to us and the passenger window was rolled down. I didn't recognize the woman. Curly short hair and a pudgy face. But the man I recognized. I sucked in a gasp of air when I saw him, causing Addison to squeeze my arm tighter. "What are you two doing out here all by yourselves?" the man asked. Addison put on a sweet smile. "Oh, we're just walking home. This one got sick," she says, referring to me. I looked at the ground so I didn't have to look at his face. "How about we take you? It's far too late to be waking home." Addison shook her head. "We're fine. You understand," she says, shooting daggers at the man. He smiles pleasantly. "Get in the car," he says in a cold voice, smile gone from his face. Addison meets his stare. "Not a chance?" "Fat man." She shoots back, breaking into a run and dragging me with her. She screams as she runs, yelling about being kidnapped. She's trying to make sure someone hears her, but I think we both know that everyone in this town is dead asleep, except for the Landrys who are stone deaf. She yells anyway. She screams louder than I've ever heard her scream. I see the Landrys' farmhouse as we run, and I almost think we're going to make it. That Addison running saved us, until a hand grabbed my hoodie and yanked me back. A strangled yell escapes my throat as the jacket chokes me. Addison skids to a stop and comes right back for me. "Let him go!" She screams, the same anger back. Only this time she's more angry than I'd ever seen her before, and for the first time. "It's not at me. Molly dear, some help?" called Percy, who now had me firmly in his grasp. "Of course," she called from the van, emerging with a gun. "I suggest you shut it, girl, and get in the van." Addison stops screaming, but her eyes convey just how much she wants to rip them to pieces. Addison does what they say, climbing in the van and sitting in the back where Molly told her to. Molly slams the door shut and then looks to me. "Otto, you've grown so much," she exclaims like a grandmother seeing her grandchildren. "Please let us go," I say, making my voice sound extra pathetic so they'd feel bad. "Oh, honey. After seeing how those people treated you, we had to do this. No child should be treated like that," she says, clicking her tongue. "You'll come home with us and we'll be a family. I'm sure you'd love to see Jukebox," Percy said, and Molly giggled. But we can't," I say, and I know it was the wrong thing because Molly's smile drops. "Why, of course you can. You're our boy." I shake my head. "But I'm not. This is kidnapping," I say more forcefully. Molly grabs my chin in her hands so tight I know I'll have bruises. "We're saving you. From all those so-called parents. And from her." Holly pointed a shaky hand to Addison, whose face was pressed up against the glass. "Please let us go," I say again. Molly's face softens, but Percy doesn't let up. "We'll make you some dinner when we get back." "Aren't pork chops your favorite?" she asks sweetly as she opens the van door, pointing the gun at Addison to keep her from jumping out. "No! Please, please!" I start to scream. Percy slaps a hand over my mouth as he shoves me in the van, slamming the door shut behind me. Addison grabs me and pulls me into the very back. She cups a hand to my ear. "Listen, we need to jump them, okay? Together we might be able to take them." I shake my head. "They're psychotic, Addie. And strong. There's no way. I doubt they know me." Addison looks at me horrified. "It's Percy and his wife. You know, my pen pal from second grade?" Addison's face goes pale. "They think I'm their son. If I play the part, maybe I can get us out. They don't like you, but if you obey them maybe they'll be nicer, okay?" Addison gritted her teeth in protest. "Please, Addie, it's the only way. You always say adapt, so let's adapt to the situation." Addison let out a haggard sigh and nodded. I knew how much she hated agreeing to things, especially adults who tell her what to do. I don't remember how long the drive was, but somewhere along the way I recognized the bridge that led into town, which means we were heading outside of town and farther away from the Landrys. They stopped at a farm. It still had an old-style barn next to the house, and a wrap-around porch. I heard the barking immediately and knew it was Jukebox. "Come on," Molly called when she opened the door. I crawled out first, Addison behind me. Addison had always been good at acting, so when she assumed the role of a meek, terrified girl who'd do anything you asked her to, I knew she was acting even if her performance was a bit too accurate. Jukebox came running up to us from behind a pickup truck, licking both me and Addison. "Juke, down," Percy called. The dog immediately sat, but looked at me with chocolate brown eyes, tongue hanging out of his face. He made a cute sight, but even though I was meeting the dog I had wished was mine, my fear outweighed my childhood excitement. "Come on, kids," Percy calls. Addison and I enter the house along with Jukebox. I see Indigo trot toward us from the kitchen. She meows a greeting and then runs upstairs. "Girl, you can follow Indigo. I'm sure you'll know what room is yours." Molly says in a cold voice, portraying just how much she hates her. Addison said a quick yes, ma'am, which I had never heard her utter before, and race upstairs. Molly seemed pleased and led me to the kitchen. Here you go, son, Percy says, plating pork chops and green beans on a plate. Molly pours a glass of milk, and I stare at it when they place it in front of me. What about Addison? Molly frowns. After all she's done to you? She doesn't need dinner. She spits out. I shake my head. But I've been mean to her too. Like the time when we were 4 and we tried to drown each other in the bathtub. Or when I pushed her into the wall and she got a concussion. Or the time. Molly cut me off. But you, my dear, have gotten past that. Until she can tame that anger, she doesn't need to eat. I couldn't eat the dinner they had made me. I lied and said I wasn't hungry and that I'd eat it tomorrow. Molly insisted on tucking me in despite the fact that I was 13 and that I wasn't her son and that she had just kidnapped me. It was scary seeing how normal she thought her behavior was. Reading me a bedtime story and kissing my forehead, wishing me good night and turning on a nightlight with stars all over it. In fact, the whole room was decorated with the universe and stars. Because I had told Percy in a letter that I loved space. It took 6 days. Addison hadn't eaten anything in that time, and even though we'd gone without food before, never for that long. On top of being weak from hunger, she had pissed them off by throwing something at Molly when she came in to give her water. When I saw Addison after the beating, I gasped. Her whole body was bruised, and for the first time she had no fight in her eyes. It terrified me when all I saw in her eyes was loneliness and sadness and pain. We're getting out of here, Addie. Promise. I snagged the keys off the counter on the 5th day and grabbed a painkiller to stick in Jukebox's food later. I took painkillers for Addie on the 6th day and managed to sneak it into her room. If the pain was dulled, she'd have more luck moving. I unlocked the door for easy access and played nice the whole time. That built up trust, just enough trust that they didn't check Addison's room at my request. She's sleeping, I had said. Molly smiled at me, brushed hair out of my eyes and said she wouldn't, and she didn't. I waited until I was sure they were asleep before walking up the steps, careful to avoid the steps that creaked. I slowly opened Addison's door and helped him limp out. I pointed out what steps creaked and helped her down. I held the screwdriver in my hand as tightly as I could. We went out the back, which didn't have a screen door that creaked. I checked to see if Jukebox was sleeping. He lay on the porch snoring loudly. I helped Addison to the truck and opened the doors slowly before buckling Addison up in the back and taking a deep breath. The engine would wake them up. I had to move quick. Start the truck, throw it into reverse, throw into drive and get out. I practiced the motions, and finally took a deep breath and started the truck. The engine was so loud I was confident it would wake Jukebox. I threw it in reverse and turned the wheel all the way right. The tires spun until they caught gravel and we flew into a 180. I threw the car into drive and took off. I had no idea where I was going, but that didn't matter. As long as we got away from that house, everything would be fine. I just drove, my head barely peeking out enough to see the road. Addison was falling asleep in the back, clutching her broken ribs. Thanks, Otto, I heard her say despite the blood rushing in my ears. I drove until I reached a town, and then I found the police station. I told them everything and showed them Addison. They got us both to a hospital, got our statement, and called our social worker. Percy and Molly were gone. Where? That still haunts me. I'm 26 now, living with my wife and our 2-year-old son. Addison got her act together and apologized for how she treated me. She's my closest friend besides my wife. But that week changed us both. The GPS on my family's phones are never turned off. No one but me, my wife, or Addison drops my son off at daycare. I never give out my phone number to strangers. Every person I meet I scrutinize. I keep handcuff keys on me at all times and I'm constantly paranoid. But despite doing everything to keep my family safe, I've never been able to outrun Percy and Molly. Every year on my birthday since then, I get a birthday card from them, But what scares me the most is when they comment about my son, Alan. When Molly writes, he looks so much like his father. I just can't wait to meet my grandson. My wife has been peeking at me from around corners and behind furniture. It's gone from weird to terrifying. My wife, Lynn, and I have been together for 6 years and married for 11 months. Our entire history together has been very normal, and never once have I noticed any weird behaviors or red flags. I can't stress enough how out of character this whole thing is for her. Lynn is very kind, intelligent, and thoughtful. She's always been the no-nonsense type of person. Being childish or trying to scare me is not something she'd normally do. She doesn't even like watching horror movies. When we first started dating, she agreed to watch The Shining with me because she knew how much I loved horror. She was so scared that she didn't even make it through half of the movie before we had to turn it off. She isn't into anything creepy, and has never been into pranks. It's just not her cup of tea. And that's fine. But that's what was so strange about this. It's just so unlike her. I should also add that she never had any mental health issues, and as far as I'm aware, it doesn't run in her family. I know some people are able to hide their mental health problems, but in the 6 years we've been together, I think I'd have seen some sort of sign. 2 months ago, I was in the kitchen making myself some coffee before work. I was running a bit late that morning and knew I wouldn't be able to make it to Dunkin' Donuts for my usual morning fix. I took a sip of my coffee as I hurried down the hall towards the front door, when I happened to notice Lynn peeking at me from around the corner ahead of me. I could only see her eyes, and a strand of her long dark hair hanging against the wall. The rest of her body was concealed behind the corner. I nearly spilled my coffee when I saw her. I did burn the shit out of my lips. "Geez, Lynn," I said, wiping a few drops of coffee from my pants. "You scared the shit out of me." She immediately popped out of view like a little kid that had been caught. I heard her scurry off towards the living room, and by the time I got to the front door, she was out of sight. It was really weird. And just totally out of character for her, like I said, but I also found it kind of funny that she was being more playful and a little less serious. I shouted that I loved her, and called her a weirdo. As I shut the door behind me, I heard her laughing. Her behavior was a bit odd, but it certainly wasn't something to call a priest over. I forgot about it by lunch, and by the time I got home she was her normal self. I didn't bring it up, and neither did she, and life went on. The next incident happened 3 days later. It was around 2 a.m. and I had woken up to get a drink. I was standing at the kitchen island, jug of OJ in hand, when I felt a strong feeling that I was being watched. For whatever reason, I looked down at the floor and saw my wife's smiling face staring back. She was peeking at me from the other side of the island, staring up at me with wide, unblinking eyes and grinning like the Cheshire Cat. I screamed, I'll admit it. Not out of irritation, but fear. For some reason at that moment I was scared. At the sound of my scream, Lynn scuttled backwards out of my view, her hands and feet smacking the tile floor as she hurried out of the kitchen on all fours. I didn't run after her, or even yell after her. I just stood there frozen in shock, wondering what fuck had possessed her to do that. It took me a little longer than I'd like to admit to go back upstairs. But I eventually did. When I got to our bedroom, Lynn was lying on her side asleep. Or at least pretending to be. I stood there for a while, watching her breathing to be sure she really was asleep. I had the feeling she might jump out at me the moment I got into bed. But she didn't. I climbed into bed and she didn't even move. Her breathing was soft and deep, and I was starting to wonder if I'd dreamt the whole thing. The next morning I waited for her to come down for coffee, and after handing her a mug and kissing her cheek, I decided to ask her about it. "What was that about last night?" I asked, keeping my tone light so I didn't offend or embarrass her. She frowned over her cup of coffee, shaking her head like she had no clue what I was referring to. "You were peeking at me again. From over there," I said, pointing to the spot on the floor by the kitchen island. She followed my gaze, and when she looked back at me she burst out laughing. She laughed so hard that I couldn't help but join her. "You creep me the fuck out sometimes, you know that?" I said. She giggled and set her cup on the counter and wrapped her arms around my neck. "You creep me out all the time, so I guess we're even," she teased. We said our goodbyes and left for work. As I drove, I kept thinking about how creepy it had been seeing her grinning at me from behind the island like that. The sounds her hands made on the floor as she crawled away. I told myself she was just trying to be silly, just trying to join me in my love of all things horror. It's not like I was afraid of her, but it still didn't sit right with me. I started seeing her peeking at me more and more. Sometimes she'd be peeking out from behind the couch or living room curtains. Once she even managed to get inside her grandmother's old trunk that sits at the foot of our bed. I might not have even known she was there at all had the trunk's old hinges not given her away. She'd had the lid propped up just enough so that only half of her face peeked through. She'd been grinning like an excited toddler. It was unnerving. I didn't even know what to say to her. All I could do was stare. When I finally found my voice, I asked her why on earth was she doing this. She didn't answer, but she had slowly closed the lid, shutting herself inside the trunk. I just walked away, feeling disturbed. I didn't understand why she was doing it, but it clearly made her happy. I just hoped she would tire of the game quickly. Lynn didn't peek at me for the next 2 weeks. I started to think she was done with her weird prank and I was relieved. We were watching a show on Netflix one night, and I jokingly said that I hadn't seen her peeking at me lately, and that she must have given up on her spy game. She looked up at me with a small smile and said, "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." I didn't say anything, but I wondered whether or not she was joking. For the next few days I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Was she still peeking at me when I wasn't looking and I just hadn't noticed? And if so, what the hell was she getting out of this? I started to feel paranoid, constantly checking whether she was watching from around the corner or behind a door. I was jumpy whenever I was home and she wasn't in full view of me. I felt stupid and a little crazy, but after a few weeks without another incident, I began to relax. I stopped checking behind furniture and walls and told myself it was just a bad memory. Then a few days ago things got so much worse. Lynn left to go to a friend's, and I lounged on the couch and played a couple games on my laptop. Around 9 p.m. I hopped in the shower, and as I was washing the soap from my hair, I felt that awful feeling that I was being watched. I slowly opened my eyes and almost had a fucking heart attack. Lynn was peeking from behind the shower curtain, her entire head stretched into the shower, leaving just her body outside. Her long dark hair hung against the curtain, the ends dripping with water. Her mouth hung open in a terrible grin, eyes wide and red, as if she hadn't blinked in a while. I screamed and jumped back against the wall. She didn't move, nor did her smile waver. Her makeup ran down her cheeks in 2 black streaks. She looked giddy and completely deranged. I was fucking terrified. We stood like that for a few moments, neither of us saying a word. Finally, after what felt like forever, she slowly pulled her head back out of the shower, and I watched her blurry figure through the curtain as she moved backwards towards the bathroom door. A second later, the bathroom door slammed shut, hard enough to rattle the mirror. I screamed again, and jumped out of the shower to lock the door. I stayed inside the bathroom for over an hour. Maybe I overreacted to some of you. But joke or not, I wasn't going to put up with the crazy shit anymore. That's what I kept telling myself as I paced in my bathroom, stopping to listen at the door every few minutes. Suddenly I heard a muffled sound, and I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, straining to listen. I couldn't hear anything, but I envisioned Lynn standing on the other side of the door, giggling at her joke. I felt a surge of anger. I was beyond pissed at being made to feel scared in my own house, and made to hide in the bathroom for an hour. All for what? Some joke? If it was a joke, it was an awful one. What the fuck, Lynn? I snapped. This shit is getting really fucking annoying. I waited for her to apologize, or to call me a jerk. But instead I heard a faint moan, so quiet I wondered if I heard it at all, and then complete silence. Lynn? I called out, not able to even hide the shakiness in my voice. I got no response. Just my own heavy breathing. I swear to God, Just fucking stop it, I yelled, pounding my fist on the door. I waited for her to cuss me out, something I would expect from me talking to her like that. I never screamed at her before. But there was nothing. Just the occasional drip from the shower head. I won't deny that I was scared. Too afraid to open the damn door and face my own wife. I waited another 30 minutes or so, which feels like a fucking lifetime when you're scared. Finally, I decided I wasn't going to spend the night hiding in my bathroom, so I got down on my knees and peered under the door. I almost expected to see her face peeking back at me, but thankfully I didn't. I could see straight down the hallway to the top of the stairs, but no Lynn. I didn't know if I should be happy about that or not. I looked for a few minutes, waiting to see her head pop up over the top step. But it never came. I stood up, my hand hovering over the door, and mentally prepared myself to open it. I slowly turned the lock with shaky fingers, and was about to yank it open when I heard a sound that still makes me feel nauseous when I think about it. A moan, louder than before, but this time I was able to tell just where it was coming from. I turned my head to the closet door as if in slow motion, and locked eyes with my wife, who was peeking out at me from the slight gap. Her eyes were still wide as ever, and her mouth was hanging open in the most grotesque gaping smile I'd ever seen. I didn't even scream. I was too scared for even that. Her hands were clasped to her chest, body trembling with sheer delight, as if she could barely contain her excitement. A short raspy moan bubbled up from her throat, deep and raw, sending a shiver through my entire body. Somehow I found the ability to pull the bathroom door open and ran as fast as I could all the way down the steps, snagging my keys and phone from the table in the living room before running outside to my car. I could hear her shrill laughter behind me, but I didn't hear her getting closer. I didn't bother shutting the front door. I drove away from the house faster than I legally should have, shivering the entire time, either from fear or the cold. Maybe a little of both. I hadn't grabbed a coat or even a pair of shoes. I was still in my boxers and my hair was still damp. I drove straight to my brother Chris's house about 40 minutes away, ignoring any and every call and text I got. I didn't check my phone until I was safely parked in my brother's driveway. Lynn had called 4 times and sent a flurry of texts, all wondering where I'd gone and why I left. Like that, I threw my phone at the dash in a rage, furious at her nonchalant attitude. My brother and his wife were surprised to see me, especially dressed in just a pair of boxers, but told me to stay as long as I needed. Chris lent me some clothes and asked me what happened. I told him Lynn and I had a fight, but didn't get into the details. I didn't want him to think I was overreacting, leaving my wife over a prank, even if it was a strange one. I mean, hadn't I encouraged her for years to lighten up instead of being so serious all the time? I had wanted her to relax and loosen up, but this was definitely not what I'd had in mind. I tried to sleep on their sofa, but my brain wouldn't let me sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lynn's face staring at me from inside the closet. Knowing she'd been in there with me the entire time made my skin crawl. She never left the fucking bathroom at all. Instead, she slipped inside the closet and slammed the bathroom door shut to fool me. The mere thought of going back home gave me anxiety. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Chris ended up giving me a sleeping pill so I was able to get a little rest. My sleep was filled with terrible dreams, all of Lynn's smiling face. I woke up just as the sun started to rise. My sore body ached from the sofa, and I felt drained. I knew I'd have to call Lynn at some point, but I didn't know what to say to her. I wouldn't be going home unless she gave me her word she'd never do any more creepy shit. I just wanted my wife back. Her normal serious self never looked so good to me. I was contemplating calling her and telling her that, when that familiar feeling came over me. I was being watched. I was staring at the ceiling, my heart in my throat. I didn't want to look away, but the longer I ignored the feeling, the worse it got. My eyes drifted away from the ceiling almost on their own. Her face was pressed up against the window beside the couch, staring down at me with that same gaping smile. Drool dribbled down her lips, leaving 2 long streaks down the glass. I didn't know how long she'd been there, but something told me she'd been there quite a while, possibly all night. I didn't bother screaming, though I was afraid anger trumped any fear I felt at that moment. I jumped up from the couch and pounded my palm against the glass. "Lynn, are you crazy? What the hell is wrong with you? Just go home," I shouted. "Now!" She didn't move, and her ghastly expression never changed. If anything, her smile only grew, as if she had never been more elated. I could hear Chris and his wife moving around upstairs, as if Lynn could hear them from her place outside. Her head twitched slightly in their direction, and she began to close her mouth slowly. Chris called my name from upstairs, obviously concerned. I turned to see him and his wife Rebecca hurrying down the steps. When I turned back to the window, Lynn was gone. The only sign she'd been there at all was the 2 streaks of drool still dripping down the glass. I tried explaining to Chris and Rebecca about waking up to see Lynn watching me through their window. They were skeptical. Who wouldn't be? Chris and I went outside to the spot in front of the window, but there were no footprints in the dirt. Just a slight indent. Animal probably, Chris guessed, and I didn't argue. He and Rebecca assumed I dreamt the entire episode, but they didn't understand, and I was too tired to explain it to them. I called out of work that day and turned my cell off. I didn't want to face Lynn. Just talking to her was too much for me at that point. I really started to believe something was irreversibly wrong with her. That no matter what promises she made, we'd never be the same again. The thought saddened me to my core. I cried most of the morning. By noon I figured I was ready to confront her. Give her one last chance to explain herself. I could at least give her that after 6 years, I told myself. I turned my phone on and saw the dozens of texts she'd sent, all from a seemingly concerned wife. "Can we talk? I love you. Please call me. I'm really worried. Can you answer? Just come home." And more of the same. All texts telling me she loved me, and she wanted me home. How worried she was. Not a damn one addressing the crazy shit she pulled. Like she hadn't been acting like a character from a Stephen King book. Even her texts were different. She normally texted novels just to tell me to pick up a loaf of bread. You'd think she'd have more to say to me after her bizarre shenanigans. I know it probably seems childish to some of you who are miles away from this situation. But if you saw the way Lynn had looked at me, how she scampered away on all fours like some wild animal, grinning at me from inside the closet like a lunatic, then I think you'd find my reaction was warranted. I ended up staying with Chris and Rebecca for another night. I didn't wake up yesterday until afternoon, and thankfully I didn't see Lynn's face watching me through the window. I don't want to pry, because it's not my place. But is this fight something that can be mended? Rebecca asked. She made us both a sandwich for lunch, and I knew she wanted to breach the subject without seeming to be nosy. I don't know. She's like a different person, I said, choosing my words carefully. I still wasn't ready for her or Chris to know the full extent of the batshit craziness I had been dealing with. People change, Ben. But she's still the same woman you married. Maybe you both just need to talk through your issues. Whatever's going on, I'm sure it can be fixed, she said, ever the peacemaker. I think it's beyond that now. I don't think talking would help. I just don't trust her, I said. The words stung in my heart. I missed and loved my wife. But how could I live with someone like that? Living in constant fear didn't sound too appealing. Lynn loves you. She has to be absolutely crushed, she said. I don't know about that, I said. Well, she certainly seemed like it to me. I've never seen her so upset. Very much unlike the Lynn I know, Rebecca said, shaking her head sadly. It took a full minute for her words to really sink in, and when they did, I felt dread worming its way through my skin. Wait. What do you mean? You saw her? You saw Lynn? I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Rebecca nodded casually as if that fact wasn't nightmare fuel. Maybe for her it wasn't. She stopped by this morning just after Chris left for work, she said, cleaning the plates from the table. I didn't see her car though. Maybe she took an Uber or something. Beck. What did she say? Did she come inside? I asked, sweat starting to break out on my forehead. I began looking around, examining corners as though a predator lurked behind them. No. She just asked if you were awake yet, and I said that you weren't. I asked if she wanted me to wake you, but she said no. Just said to let you sleep, she said as she washed the dishes. That's all? She didn't say anything else? I asked. No. She looked awful though. Like she hadn't slept in days. I think you should call her. I got up from the table and thanked Rebecca for lunch. I felt a little bit better at the knowledge that at least she hadn't come inside. Still, I needed to double check that the doors were locked. I sat for a while trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to go home, but I felt that I owed it to Lynn to help her if I could. Hadn't I swore an oath to love and honor her through sickness and in health? Clearly she was very sick. If she was sick, which I truly believed she was, I had to try and get her the help she needed. But I didn't even know where to start. I didn't want to call the police, and besides, what the hell was I going to tell them? That my wife was peeking at me? That she was being creepy? As bizarre as she'd been, she still hadn't committed any crime. Not yet anyway. The police would have probably said that I was overreacting. But this wasn't some prank. It felt wrong. Dangerous even. Like something sinister lurked beneath her smile. I knew as her husband I was well within my rights to have her committed, but what if she simply acted normal in their presence? She'd obviously been able to fool Rebecca into thinking she was just a concerned wife. As long as the doctors didn't find her a danger to herself or others, they'd have no choice but to release her after 72 hours. I felt lost and overwhelmed. So I did what any husband in my position would do. I called her mother. I didn't want to, believe me. Her mother, Marianne, and I were never on the best of terms. We'd never fought or anything like that. She just wasn't a very warm person, and wasn't really easy to get along with. She hardly ever smiled, and when she did, only her lips would move into a thin-lipped smile, leaving her eyes as blank as before. She gave off this aura that felt like she was permanently on the offensive. I'd only met her twice, and both times were for such short visits. I got the impression she didn't approve of me for her daughter. Lynn always ushered us out quickly, as she didn't want me to feel uncomfortable, which I was grateful for. Being in her mother's company felt almost unbearable, like walking on glass. I was glad when we moved 3 states away so we didn't have to see her often. I was happy to avoid the woman, but I needed her help. I really didn't want to talk to her at all, but I had to talk to someone, and someone who knew Lynn better than I did. So I grit my teeth and did what I had to. Yes? She answered, already sounding irritated. Marianne, it's me, Ben. Do you have a minute to talk? I asked. I could hear her cluck her tongue in irritation. I'm in the middle of writing some checks, but if you insist, I suppose I can spare a moment. What is it that you want to discuss, Benjamin? She said coolly. It's about Lynn. She's been acting strangely, and I was wondering if you had any idea whether there was something. I was quickly interrupted. It's a bit difficult to follow your rambling, Benjamin. What is that you want from me? She asked. I could almost see her standing there in her thin sweater and slacks, tapping her fingernails impatiently on the table. I wanted to know if you'd ever noticed any odd behavior, or possibly any mental health issues? I asked. There was a long, uncomfortable pause that I couldn't tell was because she was just thinking, or something else. Finally, after a few seconds, she spoke. I'm not sure if this is one of your jokes, Benjamin, but if so, I don't find the humor in it. Now I do have business to attend to, as I've said, so if you don't mind, dash, she said, but I cut her off before she could get rid of me. Marianne, it's not a joke. I'm sincerely concerned about Lynn's mental health. Her behavior has been very erratic lately. I'm very worried about her, and I figured as her mother you would be as well. I said, my frustration evident in my voice. If you're truly concerned, then I suggest you get the health professionals involved. I don't know what you expect of me, she snapped. I could tell she was seconds away from hanging up, and for some reason I was desperate not to let her. I had the feeling that she knew a lot more than she was letting on. Please, If not for me, do it for Lynn. I tried. I heard a faint shaky intake of breath, as if she were trying to hold her steely persona together but failing. Marianne? What's WR dash? I started. Benjamin, I don't know what to tell you. My only advice would be to seek professional help. Do not call here again. Goodbye. I tried to call out to her but she'd hung up. I tried to wrap my head around the call and her refusal to help me. Even if she didn't like me, why wouldn't she want to help her own daughter? I couldn't understand that. I tried to replay the conversation, desperate to find something I missed. After a while I almost gave up, until I remembered her last words to me. Seek professional help. She'd said those words with a bit of urgency. I could have just been grasping at straws, but no, I was sure her voice had changed ever so slightly when she'd said that. As if they were very important. What had she meant? I assumed she'd been referring to medical professionals, but maybe she was referring to someone else. Someone that she didn't, for some reason, feel comfortable saying directly. Or maybe I was just desperate. I waited for Chris to get home, and after a very long and exhausting conversation with him and Rebecca, I convinced them that Lynn truly needed psychiatric help. I didn't tell them everything. I wasn't prepared to go into it yet, but I told them about our last encounter. How she'd hidden in the bathroom, peeking at me from the closet. They were obviously shocked, but thankfully they believed me. They too just wanted to help her. Still, they didn't think it was all that serious. Weird maybe, but not dangerous. They just kept saying that Lynn had to be playing some kind of weird joke. Maybe for you too? Rebecca offered. If only half-heartedly. Chris didn't think we should involve the police just yet. He offered instead to go with me, and I readily accepted. He reasoned that calmly talking to her, trying to coax her into going willingly, was the best recourse. I agreed to do it his way. At least I wouldn't be going into that house alone. We drove over this morning, just after breakfast. There was no way I was going at night. When we pulled into the driveway, my stomach began doing somersaults. Her car wasn't there, but I still didn't let my guard down. The front door was ajar, and for a split second I thought we'd see her eyes staring through the gap. I was shaking and starting to sweat. Chris, however, was fine. He waited for me to open the door, his hands in his pockets like he was going on a fucking stroll through the park. I envied his ignorance. I pushed the door open and was immediately hit with the stench of rot. Chris smelled it too, and he walked in the house behind me with his nose scrunched up. "What do you guys use to clean the floors around here, shit?" Chris mumbled. "Shut up," I said, my eyes darting around for any signs of Lynn. The house was deadly quiet and dark despite being 10 in the morning. All the curtains were closed up tight, refusing to allow any sunlight inside. If I hadn't left it just 2 days prior, I'd have thought the house to be abandoned. We moved through each room, carefully checking any place that she might hide, occasionally calling her name. "Why the fuck are you looking under the couch?" Chris asked eventually. "Aren't we looking for your wife?" He was looking at me like I was a moron. "Let's just go upstairs," I whispered. He shook his head but followed me up the stairs to check the bathroom and spare bedroom. On the way up, my shoes crunched over pieces of glass that looked to be littered over a few of the steps. I noticed that one of Lynn and my wedding portraits that hung on the wall along the staircase had been smashed. The frame hung crookedly, all the glass removed. I stared at the picture, a lump forming in my throat. We had taken the photo just after leaving the church. After saying our vows. She looked so beautiful in her white gown. I looked at Lynn's beautiful face. I never dreamed her face would ever be a source of terror for me. We climbed the rest of the steps and checked the spare bedroom, but it looked completely untouched. I was hesitant to go into the bathroom, my fear from that night coming back to me all at once. Chris noticed, and offered to go in by himself, but I couldn't let him do that. So we walked in together, checking the closet and the shower. The bathroom looked as if it hadn't been touched since the night I left. "I don't think she's here, Ben. Why don't you pack some clothes and we'll try coming back tomorrow or something?" Chris said. I nodded and went into our bedroom and shoved some clothes into a duffel bag. When I checked inside our closet, I came across the source of the smell and gagged. Chris took one look and lost all color in his face. He had to go stand by the stairs to get away from the sight and smell. I gazed down in shock at what lay inside my bedroom closet. Soaking into the rug were at least a dozen eyeballs, all carefully laid out in pairs. Some were as large as a quarter, while others were as tiny as a marble. I stared down at the eyes she'd collected from small animals, and I wondered how she'd gotten them, and shuddered at the thought. Man, I thought I had it bad with Becca's shoe addiction. But fuck me. Your wife's in here collecting eyeballs, Chris said, gagging. Ben, I think we should go, he called from the hall. I'm getting nauseous, all right. I grabbed my duffel and shut the closet door on my new nightmare. I stepped out into the hall and took a deep breath of air. I could taste the rot on my tongue, and I couldn't help but gag. Who the fuck lines up eyeballs in their closet like that? Chris mumbled. I tried to tell you she needed help, I said. She doesn't need help, Ben. She needs a fucking exorcist, he said. You coming or what? I can't stand the smell any. His words died in his throat, and his eyes grew wide with fear. I didn't ask him why. I could feel it. Someone was watching me, and I didn't think it was the eyes in the closet. I turned around, my eyes slowly scanning the bedroom. Christ, I whispered, as I finally saw what we'd missed. Under the bed, curled on her side, watching us with the excitement of a kid on Christmas morning, was my wife. She held her hands together just under her chin, and they were shaking eagerly. Now that she knew she'd been found, I could hear the quiet noises she was making. A sort of hiccuping sound in her throat, as if the excitement was just too much for her. It was unnerving to say the least. Wide eyes, and that same huge smile. Everything in me told me to run, but I forced it away. This was my wife. No matter how twisted, she was still the woman I married. I had to help her. Lynn, I said softly. She didn't respond, but her head bobbed back and forth in two quick little movements as if she were nodding. Baby, I just want to help, okay? Can you let me do that? I asked. I had taken a single step forward, approaching her like some kind of dangerous animal. I love you, Lynn, I said softly, taking another step closer. She let a tiny moan escape her wide-open mouth, and I had to resist the urge to run. Her shoulders were starting to quiver, and her eyes grew as large as saucers. I crouched down so I could see her better, and immediately saw the blood. Her hands were covered in it. They trembled more the closer I got, as if she was barely able to contain herself. Lynn, are you hurt? You're bleeding, I said. She bobbed her head again, her bloody fingers moving up and down as if playing an invisible piano. They occasionally grazed her chin, leaving smears of blood on her skin. I wanted to recoil in disgust. The smell that was coming off of her was revolting. I could feel the vomit trying to climb up my throat. Her lips were dry and stretched thin, blood seeping between the cracks. I knew she wouldn't come out on her own, but I didn't want to leave her in the state she was in. I scooted closer and reached out to her. The excited hiccuping sounds got louder and her hands shook, fingers flexing. It was then that I could see the blood oozing from in between her fingers. Oh my God, Lynn! You're bleeding, I said. Instinctively I reached out to take her hand, but before I could even touch her, her hand sprang out towards me. A sharp pain shot through my arm, and I fell back on my ass. My arm burned, and I could see the blood dripping down onto the carpet. I looked back at her in shock and saw her grinning madly, her fingers clutching a large shard of glass. You all right in there? Chris asked from behind me. I turned my head slightly and nodded to him, cradling my arm to my chest. When I turned back to face Lynn, I saw that her focus had shifted. She wasn't looking at me anymore, and she wasn't smiling anymore either. She was staring past me, her eyes glaring at Chris the way a hungry lion might stare at an antelope. Her mouth was still hanging open, but it was twisted into a snarl. I got to my feet, and began walking backwards down the hall, afraid to take my eyes off her. "Are you bleeding?" Chris asked. The moment the words left his mouth, Lynn started fast scooting out from under the bed, the glass shards still in her fist. "Chris! Run! Go!" I yelled. He must have been too afraid to move, because a second later I felt my back bump into him. He was still standing at the top of the stairs, staring at the horror that was my wife. Lynn had crawled completely out from under the bed and stood in the bedroom doorway, her face twisted in rage. Her whole body was visibly tense. Blood ran down her fingers and onto the floor. "Jesus, Lynn," Chris said. You, playing hide and seek?" I reached back and pushed him towards the steps. "Move your ass, Chris," I said as quietly but firmly as I could. Lynn bobbed her head in fast, sharp motions, and began to grin, stretching her mouth open wider and wider so that her chin seemed to touch her chest. I heard Chris mutter a prayer, and then he was running down the stairs. I stood at the top of the steps, stuck between the love for a woman who clearly needed serious help and self-preservation. "I only want to help," I said, choking back tears. Her eyes focused on me once again as she slowly lifted the glass, holding it out in front of her. And then she started sprinting towards me, grinning with utter excitement. Thankfully my body took over and I flew down the stairs, skipping 2 or 3 at a time. I made it to the front door before I felt her leap onto my back, wrapping her arms around my neck, her open mouth next to my ear so that I could hear those terrible hiccuping sounds up close. I shook her off me, knocking her to the floor. I felt a searing pain in my back as she went, but I tore open the front door and bolted to my car. Chris was standing in the front yard, talking on the phone with the police. I didn't say a word, I just ran to my car and jumped in. Chris took the hint and followed me, still on the line with 911. I watched the rear view mirror, sure I'd see her there, running after us. But I never did. I went straight to the ER and got 11 stitches in my arm and 3 on my back. The police asked a lot of questions and went back to the house to do a search, but of course, Lynn wasn't there. They advised me to stay with a friend or relative for a while and to file a restraining order as soon as I could, but none of those things would matter. Somehow I just knew. I dropped Chris off at home and went to a motel an hour away. I wanted to put as much distance between me and Lynn as I could. This is where I've been for the last 4 hours. I thought maybe the police would find her. Maybe they'd get her the help she desperately needs. But now I don't think so. Because 40 minutes ago I got a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words. "I found you," and a picture attached. The picture was dark and grainy, but I instantly knew what it was. There was no mistaking my wife's eye. I started typing this out immediately after. I don't know what to do. I'm alone and scared, and I can't help but feel that I'm being watched. Most people think my job is pure nightmare fuel. I used to disagree with them. I work as a cell tower technician. You've probably seen videos on YouTube of some guy clinging to the top of a metal tower in the middle of a huge empty nothing. That's me. It's about the best job you can get where I live without a high school diploma, and the only real source of entertainment to boot. As a perpetual screw-up with an appetite for adrenaline, I was basically a star candidate. Really, the only 2 requirements are a basic level of physical conditioning and a complete lack of fear, both of which I have. Or at least I thought I did. 2 weeks ago, the company I work for, who shall remain unnamed lest the corporate overlords find this post, sent me out to a job site about 50 miles out of town. Rarely do I have to cross state lines, but the tower in question was about as far out of the way as it gets. Big one too. 400-something odd feet, meant to bounce signals all the way across the Appalachian Mountains from one sleepy mining town to the next. That suited me fine. I prefer working where prying eyes won't see me for one reason: base jumping. For the uninitiated, base jumping entails throwing yourself off of a big object with a parachute on. You know when you jumped off of the roof of your house as a 10-year-old with a blanket and broke your ankle and your stepdad came out and beat you with a belt before he drove you to the hospital? No, maybe it's just me. Anyhow, base jumping is basically the grown-up version of that. Minus the broken ankle and the beating, hopefully. Luckily for me, secluded cell towers happen to be the perfect place for this kind of hobby. The morning I was supposed to head out, there was a fine mist sinking down into the hollows around where I lived. The locals call it moonshine weather, which translates to stay the hell inside and get drunk instead of go to work. As tempted as I was to do just that, I'd been hoping they'd send me out that way for months, and I couldn't pass up this opportunity. I should have trusted my gut. Instead, I brewed myself a shitty thermos of coffee, threw my gear into the back of my shitty Jeep. And well, you get the idea. I drove a few hours out to the site, fooling myself all the way that the weather would clear up soon and it would be a sunny climb all the way to the top. I'd packed my parachute along with my other gear. I used to bring a GoPro along, until I realized that recording the sort of behavior that would give an OSHA rep an aneurysm probably isn't smart. I can be smart when I remember to. Anyway, I parked my Jeep outside the fence around the tower and typed the code into the electronic gate. Someone had strung razor wire over the top of it, but I doubted anyone visited much, and the wire was crumbling in places. I figured anyone who really wanted to wouldn't find it hard to bypass. My suspicions were confirmed as I drove past the tiny maintenance shed sitting on the corner of the lot, and found every inch of the corrugated metal covered in graffiti. I admired it as I opened the padlock and retrieved one of the bulbs from inside. The work order said this tower needed an aircraft warning light replaced. You know, those blinking red lights that let you know there's a giant tower out there in the dark. I took one from a dusty shelf and tucked it into my rucksack, threw on my climbing rig, checked my chute one last time, and started the climb. The start of a climb is always boring. One hand over the other, rung by rung. You're almost impatient waiting for that thrill that comes with dangling hundreds of feet above the earth. Or at least I was. But you have to pace yourself. A fall from 30 feet can be just as fatal as a fall from 400, and if I was going to go out, I knew which one I'd rather take. Most of the time you'll see tower climbers clipping a carabiner to each rung to fasten themselves in place as they go. I don't bother with that unless it's a windy day. It wasn't. In fact, the air seemed unnaturally still as I climbed. If I were a wiser man, I might have paid more attention to the prickle at the back of my neck or the sense of foreboding in my gut. But as you've probably guessed, I am not, so I didn't. Instead, I chalked it up to coffee jitters and doubled my pace. Probably just needed to take a leak. Have you ever pissed off of a 400-foot tall object? It's just as awesome as it sounds. I was around halfway up when I realized that the fog around me had grown more dense rather than less, which was strange. Usually when you get a bit of height, and the sun starts to burn away the mist, you can see just fine. Typically it's all but gone by 2 p.m., leaving you free and clear to jump from the top. I'd already picked out a nice little meadow to the southeast of the tower where I could land and have an easy hike back to the Jeep. If I couldn't see it though, that would be a problem. I'm not suicidal after all. It looked like my dreams were shattered for the day. The fog around me was so dense now that if I hadn't known better, I would have thought a storm was rolling in. But the weather forecast hadn't mentioned any chance of a storm, and there was still no wind. It was strangely silent, except for the dull ring of my boots on the rungs and my own breath in my ears. I paused to take a break. Around halfway up there are altitude markers painted on the cell towers so you can mark how far you've come, and I just passed 150 feet. Clipping a carabiner onto the rung above me for the first time that day, I leaned back and stretched, enjoying the feeling of weightlessness. I glanced down, something the veteran climbers tell you never to do, and that's when I saw it. Down below me, shrouded in mist, a shape clung to the side of the tower. I say shape because I didn't get a clear look at it. Just a shadow, maybe 100 feet below. So far away that I couldn't really even tell if it was moving. The fuck? Now I know I'm not Shakespeare, but I doubted old Bill would have reacted any differently than I did. I mean, why would anyone be climbing a cell tower in backwoods Appalachia on a day like this? Anyone besides me, that is. My first thought was that it was one of the graffiti artists who, finding their skills limited by the canvas of the old maintenance shed, had grown the balls to climb the tower and add a little color to the gray steel. Good on them. Might make for a bit of an awkward meeting when they caught up to me, but I wasn't about to call the cops or anything. I even debated hanging around until they got a little closer, but decided against it. That was my first and only good decision that day. Probably the one that saved my life. I kept climbing, reasoning that if my fellow climber made it to the top while I was still around, I'd congratulate them on their courage and ask them nicely to paint over one of the lights so that the company would send me out here in a month or two and I could get my jump on. I reached the 200-foot mark and took another break, feeling the cool wet air on my cheek, scratching under my thick beanie. The company tells you to wear a helmet, but I figured that at heights like this I'd prefer my cranium to liquefy on impact if I fall. Quick and painless. I took another look down to see how my mysterious friend was doing. It was closer. I say it because it took my brain a few seconds to register that the thing climbing up the tower toward me wasn't human. It had closed the distance between us by a few dozen feet, and it was impossible to mistake. Its arms were too long, its body too short. I caught a glimpse of dark, glistening skin through the mist, a face twisting on a knobbly neck, two eyes that were as pale and milk-white, like an old man's cataracts. I blinked. It was still there. One long arm swung over the other with unnatural grace, a hand large enough to swallow the entire rung curling around steel. The fuck? Once more and with feeling, now I'm not superstitious, or religious, or philosophical, or political, or really anything at all. I'm a monkey brain tower climber, and when I saw the thing that was following me up the tower, my monkey brain took right over. I scurried up the rungs, throwing caution to the wind, my brain trying to account for what I was seeing. Some kind of prank? A TV show, right? With an absolutely insane budget? A dozen half-hearted attempts at reason flew through my mind, each one as pathetic as the last. I climbed until I was out of breath. And my mind, looking for excuses and coming up empty, swung back around to did I really just see that? I risked a glance down. The thing was still below me and gaining. It climbed in eerie silence, not growling or snarling like a wild animal, just the quiet, fluid determination of a predator stalking prey. I caught a flash of movement, of a snub-nosed face, of naked skin and a mouth full of black teeth. I'd given an old meth head some change once, and she'd flashed me a rotten grin full of teeth like that. There was only one way down now, and that was up. I climbed as quickly as I could, throwing caution to the wind. The 300-foot mark passed in a blur. 350. I was starting to flag. Every breath burning in my lungs. I could taste copper in my mouth, and my eyes were blurry. I started to get clumsy. I missed a rung with my foot, almost falling. I clung there, terrified that I would feel long fingers close around my foot. I kicked the rungs once, then managed to get my boots back in place and kept going. I reached the tower's uppermost platform. The trapdoor was locked, secured by a padlock. Of course it was locked. I tore a glove off with my teeth and let it spiral away, fumbling in my pocket for the key. Nothing. My entire body was seizing with fear. The piss that I'd been saving for the top of the tower was running down my leg. I unhooked the hammer on my tool belt and bashed the padlock. It came open, bouncing off my arm. I shoved open the door and hauled myself through, landing on the small platform at the top like a trout from a creek. Through the grates I could see the thing right below me. It opened its mouth, jaw cracking to reveal a mouth that was too wide. Inside that mouth was another mouth, and another, and another. I screamed. Well, I did my best with whatever air was left in my lungs. It sounded more like a whimper or a sob. I stood with my back to the top of the tower, watching as it moved half hidden below me. I slung one leg over the railing at the edge of the platform and checked the straps of my parachute. The sky was gray in every direction. Nothing but endless, mind-numbing gray. Looking back, I feel as though I should have at least had some idea of where the sun was, but there was nothing. Just an endless field of twilight. I couldn't tell which direction I was facing, or where the meadow I'd planned to land in could be. I'd be jumping blind. Into the fog. No idea of where I was headed or even how close I was to Earth. It was insane. It was my only option. As the creature lifted one glistening arm over the edge of the tower, ready to haul itself up after and grab me, I threw myself off. Normally this is where I let out a whoop, revel in the feeling of the wind on my face, the weightlessness. This time I fell in silence, eyes full of freezing tears as the cold wind scoured my skin and hair. I had a pair of goggles slung around my neck to shield my face, but I'd forgotten to put them on. I seized the ripcord and pulled for all I was worth. There was a reassuring snap of nylon against air, followed a bowel-loosening tug, and my feet kicked out in front of me. Thankfully instinct took over, giving my overtaxed brain a break. I glanced up and over my shoulder, wind whistling in my ears, but I could see no sign of the creature above me. I hauled on the steering lines, straining to see any sign of the ground below. There was nothing. A few long moments passed. Then I caught sight of a tree spearing through the mist. Another followed, then another, and then I was sailing between them. Branches slapping my face, battering my arms and legs. I flew free of the trees and straight into the side of the fence at the base of the tower. Razor wire slashed my hands as I struck the top of the fence with enough force to knock the wind out of me. I fell backward, landing in the dirt, shredded nylon billowing down to cover my face. I struggled free from the remains of my chute and unbuckled the pack, leaving it all in a heap by the fence. I limped for the jeep. Above I could see no sign of the creature. I hauled the door open and started the engine, praying that the faulty spark plug I'd been meaning to replace for months would do me this one last solid. The engine sputtered to life. Something flew overhead. A blur. I caught sight of long limbs spread wide, of membranous wings billowing in the sky. Eyes locked on mine as the predator glided silently overhead, banking, turning toward me. I threw the jeep into reverse, tires spinning in loose dirt. My head bounced off of the headrest as I crashed through the gate. Then I was off, jostling down the gravel-packed road. I didn't stop driving until I reached home. Autopilot must have kicked in because I drove myself to the ER. They must have thought I was some kind of crazy person, eyes wide, paint soaked with piss. They had to peel my fingers from the bloody steering wheel before they could get me inside. It's been 2 weeks now, and the stitches across my arms and hands are only just healing. I'll have the scars for the rest of my life. I'm writing this with the doors locked and my stepdad's old 12-gauge leaned against the desk next to me. I should get a dog. Maybe 2. The mist is back, and somehow the mountains just don't seem as safe as they used to. The screen of my phone just lit up. A text from the company. Another job. Another site. I don't think I'll answer.